Okay, I think we'll get started, Daria. I know you have a lot of material to cover. So again, hello, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar on mastering environmental desktop reports. We have over 100 people on today's call from around the country representing lenders, CRE investors, and a couple of law firms as well. My name is Gary Kulik, and I am the marketing director here at CREtelligent. I am joined by my colleague and CREtelligent environmental product manager, Daria Milburn, who will take you through today's session. Desktop reports are a prudent means of conducting environmental due diligence, and they're often used as a cost-effective alternative to a phase one ESA, but they do not provide CERCLA protection. And Daria is going to get into all of that and more. She'll break down the various types of desktop reports, when you might use one over the other. And as Daria says, it's all about the context in which the report is being used, and she's going to talk all about that today. Before I hand it over to Daria, I wanted to cover a few quick items, housekeeping items. The webinar is scheduled for 45 minutes today. Should you have any questions during the session, you can submit them using the Q&A feature down at the bottom of your Zoom view there at the bottom bar. So again, submit those questions at any time during the webinar, and we'll try to answer them at the end of the webinar. As time permits. Also, we'll be sending a recording of today's session in an email that'll go out tomorrow that you can share with your colleagues. And with that, I think I'll go off camera, Daria, and turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks, Gary. Well, hi, everybody. Thank you for attending our webinar. To some of our repeat attenders, you're going to see some familiar content, although I like to shake it up every now and then so you can see some new stuff too. And for those of you who haven't attended one of my webinars before, welcome. And I apologize because you're just going to get hooked and you're going to want to come to more, and we'll be happy to offer them. So if you have ideas that you want us to present on in the future, please feel free to share that with Gary, and we'd be happy to cover some of that content for you. All that being said, let's dive in. So we're going to talk a bit about mastering some of those environmental desktop reports. So if this will cooperate with me and advance my slides, which it's not. Oh there we go. So here's a slide that many of you will already be familiar with if you've been to my previous webinars, but it is a very useful slide. It puts everything into context. You'll see that right now I'm using the industry terminology, but we're looking at everything that gives you the least information all the way up to the most intensive information. And if you'll indulge me to be a little self-serving, I'd like to put this in terms of our CREtelligent products. Many of you are already using our products, and for those of you who aren't, you can see what they are called and how we refer to them, but you'll recognize these names quite well. And out of this, we have a subset today, which is the desktop reports. And that would be our Enviro Pre-Screen, the EPS Pro Insight, and the EnviroScreen RSRA. And actually, if we go back for a second, you'll see how each product iterates on the previous product. So the Enviro Pre-Screen is a public record search of numerous environmental health and safety databases maintained by regulatory agencies. It looks for listings related to environmental concerns, health, chemical storage, waste permits, hazardous material or waste use, known contaminated properties, known violations, anything that's been, and I'm going to emphasize this, anything that's been reported to a regulatory agency. That doesn't mean that you're going to find things that haven't been reported. And so one thing that I always caution people is, and you'll see me repeat this multiple times, no listings doesn't mean no problems. It just means no one's been told about it. So they focus, for our EPS, we focus on the site and surrounding area, and we go out to a 1/8 mile radius of the subject property. And that's fairly common for many data providers as well. We'll go to a very tight radius to serve as a quick screening. Our next step up from that is the Pro Insight. We take everything that would be in our EPS report, and what we layer on top of that is an environmental professional's opinion. So we take our in-house environmental professionals and we take their knowledge and we apply that to reviewing data in the reports. And then they give a summary and opinion of their findings. The beauty of that is that it's a fully insured environmental opinion in a full document that goes right in your file. The next step above that builds on the Pro Insight. So we keep our database, but this time we expand the database to meet the ASTM standard, which goes out to a mile from the subject property. And then we add in a review of a questionnaire. We add in a review of historical records. And it could be a combination of any of the following: aerial photographs, fire insurance maps, city directories, to look into the history of the property and the surrounding area and have a better idea of who has occupied that site. And you might ask, why would that be important? The reason is that comprehensive environmental regulations didn't really come into effect until, they started in the 70s, but they really weren't in full effect until the 80s and got very robust in the 90s. So anything that might have happened prior to any of these environmental programs existing may not have been caught, may not have been reported. They may not have required. They didn't require dry cleaners to register as hazardous waste generators. They didn't require gas stations to register their underground storage tanks. Now, you might stumble on this in historical records as you're researching, but you're not going to see that pop up in a database report. We might, however, see that in an EnviroScreen or an RSRA, as it's commonly called. And the RSRA is a terminology that was applied by the Small Business Administration. And this is actually a report modeled on the requirements from the SBA through their SOP 5010, which focuses on their due diligence requirements for any government guaranteed loan through the Small Business Administration. So, like I said, these are our desktop reports, and this is what we're going to focus on today. Now, given that we're around lunchtime, I think what we should probably do is put this in the context of lunch. So your environment pre-screen is a ham sandwich, and it starts with bread and ham, and that's your sandwich. You take your Pro Insight, you take your bread and your ham, but golly, you sure could use some mustard. And our EP opinion adds that mustard, and it just takes a little extra to flavor that sandwich. But with the RSRA, we feel like, I really like my sandwich, but I want to add in some more color to it. Maybe a questionnaire, maybe some fire insurance maps, maybe some city directories. And we find ourselves with a delicious ham sandwich of an environmental report. So, sticking on our lunch theme, let's talk a little bit about the ingredients that go into each of these desktop reports. So first and foremost is the database information. So the type of information that's included are environmental records that are maintained at municipalities, counties, states, or federal agencies. They usually focus on permits, programs, violations, spills, or other environmental conditions that might be reported. It tracks addresses, it tracks responsible entities, the dates of these issues, status, and any other pertinent details. Sometimes we'll find, being from Connecticut myself, you'll notice this is a Connecticut-heavy presentation. The state of Connecticut has copious notes. And so a lot of times we'll find very detailed explanations from the regulatory agencies in some of the note sections. And other times we don't get very much information at all. It just depends. It's very agency specific. It's very state specific. Not everybody does it the same way. This comes in raw digital files that are updated on varying cadences. So some of these databases are updated monthly, quarterly, semi-annually, or annually. And so this data is constantly being refreshed. And generally we see every quarter a refresh in data, but it's possible to see it sooner. And we'll show you an example of how just in a short period of time, you might see a change in a listing a little bit later in this presentation. Some key considerations, like I mentioned earlier, though, anything that occurs in a database report only reflects what's been reported. So again, if you take anything from this presentation, please remember that no listings doesn't mean no problems. It just means nothing's been reported. The data is controlled by the regulatory agencies. They maintain it, they update it, and so like any government agency, there can be flaws. So there's also inconsistencies that can result either in misplotting of data or inaccurate data. There are no data standards to how this information is entered. And so it's really important to remember that, because that's why you'll see varying terminology on closure, for instance. You know, some states call it no further action. Some programs call it closure. Some say no further remedial action plan. Some call it response action outcome. All these things are similar, but different enough in the context of their own agencies. So bearing that in mind, you want to remember that those inconsistencies then lead to need for further interpretation. So some of the agencies that you commonly see maintaining these databases would be the EPA, of course, or at the state level, you might see TCEQ or North Carolina DEQ, which is where I sit now, Mass DEP or California Regional Water Quality Control Board, any number of agencies, and they're all different names and they all do similar things and maintain similar data. Aerial photographs. These are a historical resource. So what you'll probably find with these is that they've been conducted at periodic intervals dating back to about 1918. Airplanes would fly, flight patterns, flight lines, and you get these mosaic photographs along these flight paths that make up the country. And what they're really great for is showing historical development of a property over time. Some of the considerations to remember is that image quality can vary. There can be gaps in coverage. These are usually ordered through a database provider, or can sometimes be found in online or in archives at state agencies or state libraries, private libraries, universities. There's a whole lot of resources, and all of them may have varying extensive coverage. So we do our best, but sometimes there will be gaps. Fire insurance maps are similar. These go back a little further, back to about 1867, and their purpose was exactly as they're stated. They were used by insurance companies to determine degree of fire hazards on properties. They'll show the shape, size, and construction of dwellings, commercial buildings, and any fire risks that might be present. The reason that they're very handy in environmental reports is that it also gives us some insight into where there might have been storage of potential chemicals or tanks that may have resulted in an impact on a property. They're very handy for showing the historical development of a property, but again, the image quality can vary. There can be gaps in coverage. The key can be cryptic, and sometimes that writing can be very hard to read. These are usually ordered again through database providers. They've got some great resources, so they've made it great for everybody to have a centralized place to order them. And they can also be found online or in some archives at state or private libraries or universities as well. City directories, and I apologize, the image quality isn't fantastic here, but we want to think of these as sort of the equivalent of white and yellow pages, for those of you who remember what phone books are. They're like the white and yellow pages, but they're run by address, not by name. So it's handy in our research because we can go through and we can look up street addresses of a subject property, and if we know them, the neighboring property addresses, and it will show the occupants at each address. So if there's a business of concern, it may show up. Again, there's going to be gaps in coverage, and usually ordered through database providers, and we access this information and we incorporate it again in our reports. So what are the reports? Well, the first level of desktop report is the Enviro Prescreen. This is our flagship product here at CREtelligent. It is probably the one that is the most commonly ordered. But the EPS in and of itself has many variations. Its ideal use is just to be a quick check on a property. It is not comprehensive. It does a quick look at what potential listings there may be for a subject property and the immediate surrounding area. So it contains point of interest listings that might have come up with different databases. It's good for identifying big problems, big known problems, and a current status of those problems, and often is used as a due diligence litmus test to determine what is the next step to be done. It provides ratings and plotting of points of interest relative to your subject property. It provides summaries of those listings in a tabular form, starting with anything related to your subject property. You'll see that what we do in our EPS report is we will give you the name of the site as it's recorded with the agencies, the address of the corresponding property, and what databases these are listed in. So for each individual listing, you will see them listed in the table below. If there's no listings for your subject property, there's nothing to list. But if there's surrounding properties, those will be summarized in the nearby property table, which follows the subject property. It provides some very high level information. If there's a closed status or whatnot, if it's provided, you will see that right here in this table. And then, of course, you'll see the risk score that associates with that particular property. So if we take our Enviro Prescreen and we say, okay, well, I would like a little bit more information. We have our EPS Advanced. So if we looked at our Enviro Prescreen, this is the standard type of table you'd see. Your EPS Advanced will take that a little bit farther and it will provide expanded details. So you have an option to click for details, which then would lead you to the back of the report where you'll get, expanded details for each listing, and they may be quite lengthy. It is something that if you have a trained eye and you know what you're looking at can be very helpful. So the components that go into an EPS report are mapping. And if you go to our Radius website, you have a parcel-based experience. And we do our best to cross-reference with our GIS partners who leverage the public record and as well as county assessors to locate properties by APN. You can search by address, you can search by APN, or you could draw your own parcels. You might find that there's a larger area, you have multiple parcels. You can select multiple parcels, or you could just draw the area that you're focused on. We get raw data from our data partners, and we translate that data into a readable format, which would be our EPS report. And then once we get that data, we also evaluate the level of severity for each listing in a category, and we score it, and we cross-reference that with mapping information because the distance is very important when you're looking at your potential risks. So what does the EPS score do? Well, it tells you that something of note has occurred. So if there is a listing of low in a report, that means that the listing is likely to be less severe in nature based on the category or distance from the subject. It doesn't mean that there's no risk at the property. It doesn't mean the property is clean. Remember that this is computer generated, so we're taking as much information as we can through the algorithm and looking at what is the potential, but it doesn't mean that there's no issue. But what we are saying is the severity of this might be a little less compared to other types of categories. A moderate listing would be that this listing is worthy of additional scrutiny and indicates that there's a feature or there's something noted that could be a higher potential for risk to the property. And the type of thing I would say, would fall into moderate is you'll likely see like a stormwater permit. It's a permit. They're allowed to do it. That's why they have a permit. If there isn't a violation on the permit, then they're operating fine. That's good. But there is an opportunity for them to have a problem. Hazardous waste permits. Yes, you can generate hazardous waste. That is allowed. You have a permit. It doesn't mean you've had a release, but it is something to be aware of because there could be if it's not being handled properly. So you generally see things that are permit related in the moderate category. And then we have our elevated category. And this is something where it's more likely to have had an impact on your property. The severity of the listing is something that really requires attention, maybe requires additional research, or at the very minimum, asking your client and having a conversation with your customers or your sellers or whomever you're working with for more information about what might be at stake. If there isn't supporting documentation, if nothing can be produced, then an elevated listing might be something where you consider getting a higher level of due diligence. To talk a little bit about the environmental data cycle, when the data comes in, it starts with things that are like operating permits or release of chemicals. Those get reported to regulatory agencies. Those agencies then enter it into their electronic record, which becomes some bulk data. Data providers will download that bulk data and they'll organize it. CREtelligent will send a request for site-specific information to our data providers, and then we will get a raw data file provided to us. And we work our magic and we decipher that and organize it into the EPS report that you all order or can order through our Radius platform. We have multiple scoring options for our EPS reports. And this is all about how the data is depicted. So we first start with our single rating, which says of all of these, the highest rating is elevated, therefore the report is elevated. Something in everything that's reported back is of concern, subject or offsite. We have our split rating, which splits the subject property from offsite listings. And so what you have there is your ability to go, oh, I see our subject is the elevated and the offsites aren't as intense as our subject property, or vice versa. Sometimes it's nice to know that your subject is low and the offsites are elevated. That tells you you have greater risk coming from your offsite properties than your subject. It really depends on what your biggest interest is. Now, we have some clients who have said they're only interested in the subject and they don't want any ratings on the surrounding properties. So another option would be to understand what the rating is on your subject property and to know that there are other listings in the surrounding area. You still get a table telling you what they are, but it just doesn't rate them. That allows you to decide what you think is a concern or not. Some of our lenders have, some of our clients have very well-trained staff, and so they do that data interpretation on their own. And then we have some clients that don't want any scoring at all. So we have an option to have no scoring. You know that there are listings, you can see what's there, but there is no scoring applied to it, and that allows a user to interpret that information according to their own risk tolerance. Some of the considerations with the EPS, again, it only reflects what's been reported to a regulatory agency. Government agencies have no consistency of how the data is entered, including mapping. There's no common GIS system or portal for them all to use and link their listings to. They don't correlate with county assessors. They don't account for historical site concerns that predate environmental regulatory programs. What does that mean? Well, we talked about that a little bit earlier. Comprehensive environmental regulations really didn't come into play until the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And so anything that happened pre-1970 likely isn't going to show up unless they found a problem later. and discovered it, and we're able to say, oh, well, this is because of the former use. But we don't always find that being the case. And so again, no listings doesn't mean no problems. I think also it's important to remember that data can change as records are updated. And I'll give you an example of what data changes can look like. So recently we had a user say, well, they got different risk ratings on the same property within a short period of time. And when we looked into it, we saw that a report that was run just a few months before, the original report was in November. And the second report, I believe, was just in this past January. The site is listed, Tom's TV and Auto Repair, but in November it was listed as off-site at 140 South Main Street. Just a few months later, the same report was run, but now it's listed as on-site. It's still Tom's TV and Auto Repair, but if you look very closely, the subject property address was updated to be more consistent with where it actually is located. And so that identified it and moved it squarely into the subject property parcel. Whereas before it was plotting as nearby but off, all related to an address change. So that's where this information can change at the source. And if we get it, we will share that. But we don't always know that because the regulatory agencies are the ones in charge of that data. Oh, I have more animation. So this just highlights how the public record is imperfect. This data is owned and maintained by the regulatory agencies. As we saw, it could be subject to errors, it could be subject to change, and erroneous data really has to be fixed at the source. Doesn't always reflect the actual location of concern. A lot of times we'll see with Superfund listings that the address of record is actually the administrative offices of the responsible party and not the actual impact location. In Chattanooga, Tennessee, there's about 19 Superfund sites, all with the same address, none of which are anywhere near each other. That's because the address is the administrative offices, but the actual Superfund sites are plotted as polygons in the surrounding area. Sometimes the area of impact is really large and includes your subject property, even though your subject may not be the source. And that's important to remember. And what you do with that information is really up to your risk tolerance. But if you need help, we'll see what we can use in some of our future products coming up that can help you just decipher what to do about it. I think the other thing to remember also is that rural areas are notorious for poor quality records, poor quality mapping, poor quality data. There aren't a lot of resources. Coming from New England myself, I know that there are a lot of small rural towns where they don't even have full-time staff in their offices. So it's important to remember that the context of where you're ordering reports and what you're looking for. And if you're having difficulty locating a property or you're having difficulty understanding why you're not seeing something that you expect to be there, remember the area might be influencing that. So if you find yourself looking at a report and saying, I don't even know what I'm looking at, what can I do? This is where we have our EPS Pro Insight. And it does exactly that. It provides the insight of a professional. Its ideal use is for users who don't have qualified staff. Or even if you just feel like you think you know what you're looking at, but you need an environmental translator for you. Or you just want an EP's opinion. And that environmental professional's opinion can be very helpful and shed an awful lot of light for the user. The content includes our EPS Advanced and a summary of findings, as well as the EP opinion. So you'll see on this particular one, we give an overall synopsis. The subject property is low, and we recommend no further assessment. It's good for identifying big problems. It's good for understanding the current status of a property or the surrounding area. And again, like the EPS, it's a good due diligence and litmus test. But this time, you won't have to guess whether you think you need to do more. You can rely on the opinion of a professional to tell you whether they feel additional research is warranted. And finally, it's very handy to have official file documentation in your file. The additional benefit of the EPS Pro Insight is that you get a fully insured professional opinion. So if you're not sure what you're looking at, you don't have a lot of confidence in it, and you come to us for a Pro Insight, our environmental opinion is backed by our insurance. So we want to be mindful of our time. We're at 1:30. We are coming into the final home stretch. I am happy to take questions as we move along near the end and hopefully clarify any of this for you. But let's move into the EnviroScreen, also referred to as the Record Search with Risk Assessment, or RSRA. For SBA lenders, it's this is a very well-known report. Any SBA lender would use it. You can use it when you need historical context. If you want more than an EPS, but less than a phase one, this is a great alternative. It's very cost effective. If you're risk averse but cost conscious, this report will provide you a whole lot of information about the property. It doesn't include a site visit, but it does do a deep dive into the historical, so it can give you some really good insight into the property uses in the past. It includes an ASTM database report, a review of historical sources like aerial photographs, fire insurance maps, city directories, a review of a questionnaire, and of course the EP opinion. All of these things are put together in a very concise package with very clear conclusions about whether or not you have a low risk or an elevated risk and what to do next. It's good for documenting your subject property risk as well as the risk in the surrounding area. And all of that comes down to looking at the historical documents. So if you'll indulge me for a moment, I'm going to take a break. First, Gary, do we have any questions before I move on?
Yes, Daria, we did have a couple that came in. One that had to do with some of the information that you just presented. I often have to provide documentation to my loan file on environmental findings. Would the Pro Insight provide that?
Yeah, the Pro Insight can be very helpful, and has an EP opinion that can go right in the file. I think also where the Pro Insight can be helpful is, it like I said, it's not uncommon to have mapping be a little bit off, whether somebody keyed in the latitude, longitude incorrectly, or just altogether the agency has the address incorrect. The best thing you can do is, if you have your supporting documentation and you come to us and say, we don't feel this listing is on site, what can we do? We can review that information and we can issue the Pro Insight with the EP's opinion saying, this is what this report says, but we have supporting documentation to say that's not the case. Therefore, this is not an issue. And it becomes very handy for our customers to use. It also helps to, like I said, translate some of that information so it's a little bit more understandable. So I would say if you're interested in a Pro Insight, that is definitely a useful tool for a credit file or an underwriting file of any sort.
Great. Thanks, Daria. Another one came in back when you were talking about the sources of the data, and a lot of it coming, from public records. It was around erroneous data would have to be fixed. Who's responsible for fixing the data?
That's a really good question. If you find that there's erroneous data, the only way to permanently get it fixed for future reference is to go straight to the source, to the regulatory agency themselves. They're the ones that maintain that data. I would say that if you're going to the regulatory agency, it's important to have all your supporting documentation to help them understand why you're contesting some of the information that they have. This especially is useful when a point of interest might be plotted on your subject property, but it's 2 miles away, or it's a half a mile down the street and it didn't plot properly. Some of the data providers will move the points of interest or plot them as they're instructed, but that doesn't fix it at the source. So if you were to change providers or you were to rerun a report, it's possible that you might find that same inconsistency arise again until the actual agency fixes it.
Great, perfect. And Daria, we do have a couple of more. How are you tracking for time? You want to address those now or save them?
So let's address some of those questions now.
Okay. Yeah, so it was related to RSRA. I've seen what looks to be an RSA, but it has a moderate risk rating. Was I looking at an RSRA as defined by SBA?
That's an excellent question. So we have two versions of the RSRA. One is for conventional loans. Some people like the moderate category. There are shades of gray. And so for lenders that aren't doing an SBA loan, but want that historical and also want a little bit of wiggle room, that moderate category will show up. However, the SBA will not accept a moderate. So it has to be low or elevated. Those are the only two options that are accepted by the SBA. So we do have two versions, an SBA version and a non-SBA version of the RSRA, or the EnviroScreen as we call it, so that our users have some flexibility for their file.
Perfect, great. Another great one that came in. Do you work with credit departments on policy to determine what report to use based on loan amount, or do you recommend starting on a more standard report and move to a phase 1 or higher based on initial findings?
So yeah, we definitely work with several clients because a lot of these programs, these environmental risk programs, are housed through the chief credit officer. So yes, we have consulted on credit policy. I think a lot of times you'll find that there's a tiered approach. First, looking at with the current property use, and if you have any information about a former property use, you can kind of judge by that whether you think you need to move up to a higher level of due diligence. So, if you know your property is currently a daycare, that's a fairly benign use. It's likely not going to present a lot of risk. Daycares don't use a lot of chemicals. They don't generate a lot of hazardous waste. There's diapers, and some might argue that those are technically hazardous, but they're not by definition for the regulatory agencies. So that might be a low risk use, and so you might be able to start with something a little bit lower, like an EPS. But if you've got a manufacturing facility, any EPS, even an RSRA, they're going to come back elevated just by virtue of the use of the property. And then any other violations that they might have had will compound on top of that. So without getting boots on the ground and eyes on the property at a higher risk property, that would be a difficult thing to start with a lower level of due diligence. Sometimes, however, you'll find you already have it on your books. You don't really want a new phase 1. You just want to know, has anything happened since you put it on your books? And that might be where an EPS could be a good use. But we certainly, I advocate a tiered approach. I think if somebody is unclear as to where to start, I always say that the SBA has put together some really fine guidelines for their own lending. They start with an RSRA on everything, and then based on the findings of the RSRA, they will either require a phase 1 or some other level of due diligence or nothing further. And that tiered approach really is quite valuable. You can get a lot moved through the system. If you think about an RSRA, it takes maybe about 5 to 7 business days versus a phase 1, which could take 10 to 15 business days and then require review by the internal departments. So it depends a lot about your portfolio, where you're lending, who you're lending to, where the bulk of your risk is. And we can happily talk about that a little bit further if you'd like to offline.
That's great, Daria. And I think, we've seen a lot of lending policies, right, over certainly over your career. And I think we've actually consulted and helped lenders with their policy and develop them. So to the person who asked that question, if you want any more insight, reach out to your CREtelligent representative, and we could probably help you in that area further. And then, Daria, I do have one more question regarding SBA. It kind of came in from the same person who asked the earlier one about the RSRA. But why would SBA be satisfied with an RSRA if it does not provide CERCLA protection?
Well, I think that goes back into that tiered approach. SBA does a lot of lower balance loans. They want to keep the process moving. They don't want to be onerous. They also want to control costs for their borrowers. And so the reason they don't dive straight into a phase one, even though I don't think they'd object to doing phase ones on everything if they felt that they could convince their customers to do it, is that it's a better way to get a good snapshot. These reports, they end up usually being, less than $700. I know that we could do it at a much better price point than that here, but you'll find that generally throughout the industry, you'll have folks charging anywhere from $500 to $700 for an RSRA, and you get a good amount of information and a good snapshot into the property's history. And I think the SBA is happy to know the historical, and if the historical pieces check out, then they're satisfied to continue moving along.
Great. I think that's the bulk of the questions. I just wanted to point out, Daria, you had mentioned earlier, about, so much of what we talk about and do is around the transaction, right? The origination of the loan and the transaction. But as you had mentioned earlier, once that loan, falls into your servicing portfolio, what can you do? At that point, you're not going to go out and order a phase one against all the properties in your portfolio, but there are some very low level screening tools or desktop tools that can be used for those instances where you just want a real quick check to see if anything's changed. But really, thanks for bringing that up. Again, everything we talk about is generally around the transaction. And so with that, Daria, what else you got for us? Anything else?
Yeah, so I just wanted to, thank you all really for being a great audience. And since I love to bring things full circle, I was wondering if you'd let me take you out to lunch. Can we go to Subway? Let's get in my car, plug in. Let's go to the Subway at 5616 Connecticut Avenue Northwest in Washington, D.C. I know it's not in Connecticut, but again, Connecticut. All right. Yeah, cool. Okay. Subway, we got their hours. Got a cute, it's blocked by a tree, but it's a cute little strip center. That's fantastic. That's good. All right, good. Let's just screen it before we go there, shall we? Yeah, our subject is low. There's no findings. There's a cleaner nearby, but it's not our subject property. We're good, right? We're good. What could that be? Yeah, no, our EPS advance did not pick up that our property at 5616 Connecticut Avenue Northwest was a dry cleaner. So this photograph was taken in the 1920s. And, if you're sitting there going, what is she trying to tell me? What I'm trying to say is exactly what we said along. It depends on the history of your property. It depends on what you're interested in. Database reports are really great for quick screens, but they don't provide you a lot of history of your property. Dry cleaners are one of the highest polluting industries. They are known for some of the largest problems, health problems, contamination plumes. They're difficult to remediate. And I feel sorry for the dry cleaner down the road because they're probably cleaning up some problems from this very particular dry cleaner themselves. So I just want to point out on this picture too, I particularly love the reflection of the old cars. I don't know if you can see them. Super fun. But that being said, those are our desktop reports. As we saw, they each built on each other. Thanks for going to lunch with me today, everybody. And if you have any other questions or it hits you later on, feel free to reach out to any of us. I also would like to say a shameless plug, go UConn. Back in the day, and I will tell you this picture is probably about 30 years old. I was one of several UConn Husky mascots. I did what was called the nerd events. This particular event was taken with me next to my now husband when Homer Babbage Library got the internet. So
And that's
Yeah.
both the women and the men, right? Huskies.
I didn't do the athletic events. I did the nerd events. I did the opening of the engineering building. I did internet at the library, alumni association, nerd events. But still, in
And
my
that's just
heart.
one of many reasons why we love our Daria.
You also
Thank
love
you.
me because I will not sing the fight song, but you know I can.
That's great. Well, thank you, Daria, very much for a very informative 45 minutes and for sharing your knowledge with us. And thank you to everybody who joined us today. Again, I think you'll all agree, very informative, very detailed. As mentioned earlier, we'll be sending out an email with a recording of today's presentation. If you have any additional questions, you can reach out to your CREtelligent representative and they can hit Daria up, or they'll most likely be able to answer those questions on their own. And they can guide you through CREtelligent's suite of desktop reports and the solution that's right for you. Also be watching for our next webinar, which I think we're scheduling later in April, where we'll explore the world of Alta land surveys and related Table A items. So we're looking at hosting that later in late April, early May. And then that will be followed up by a session on the nuances of due diligence for multifamily agency lending. So there's a lot of nuances and a lot of details around that that we'll be sharing. And with that, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Daria, and have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.